Welcome to our next webinar as part of the series on exploring social pedagogy concept at turbulent times. We suddenly find ourselves back in those turbulent times with a vengeance, I think. So we keep running these webinars until we're out of ideas. Basically, today's webinar is focused on the 4 aspects of a message, which is a very interesting communication model developed by a German communication guru called Friedemann Schulz von Thun. And it helps us to explore how can we actually communicate more effectively in practice. Why does miscommunication occur? And sometimes why is it more likely to occur with certain people in certain relationships compared to others? So I'm delighted to be joined by Nicole Ashworth from Middlesbrough Council, and later on by my colleague Alex Priver from ThemPra. To just shed a little bit of light on it. So the webinar structure is the usual. So I'll give a brief introduction of the model, and then we'll have a little fishbowl discussion with Nicole and Alex before we then kind of go into a wider exploration with all of you and try and draw out some key learning points for practice. Okay, so in a nutshell, the 4 aspects of a message is a very simple model. It's been developed, as I said, by a German communication theorist called Schulz von Thun, who's done lots of work in psychiatric settings, but has found that this model equally applies to any settings where people communicate, which is everywhere. And he says that there are 4 different aspects to any communication message that we send back and receive, and then obviously respond accordingly. So the first thing is the factual level. So when we talk, we communicate facts. So that might be things like, I'm hungry, it's cold, or I need this report done by Friday. There's a factual statement in each of those sentences. Yeah. There's also, and this is where it gets a bit more interesting, the relationship aspect. So I only say things to other people because I have a relationship with them. I want to communicate, to engage with them. So every message I send also says something about my relationship. I'm telling you that I'm cold for a reason. You know, it says something about our relationship, or telling you that I'm hungry because I want you to know that I'm hungry. Or I'm telling you that I need this report by Friday because you know, I'm the boss and you have to do what I ask you to do, kind of thing. Okay, so it tells us something about the relationship. In addition, there's also an appeal aspect to each message. So with each message I'm sending, I also appeal for you to do something in response to it. Okay, so that might be telling you that I'm cold because I would like you to close the window, or telling you that I'm hungry because I'd like you to prepare dinner, or I'm telling you that I need this report done by Friday because I want you to get on and do this report rather than stay in the kitchen and have a chat with the colleagues. And finally, there's also an element of self-disclosure to each message we're sending. So that might be, what does this message say about me, how I see myself, and what's going on for me. So that might be about my emotional state, my mental state, or my own kind of concept of who I am and to what extent I'm as important as the person I'm talking to, or do I see myself as more important than them, or whatever. Okay, so far so good. Now this is where it gets very interesting, is that these 4 aspects are always part of each message that gets sent. And of course, in communication, we send messages back and forth all the time. So we basically have 4 sets of lips with which we talk. So when I talk, I send messages on all those 4 aspects. But you also have 4 sets of ears. So you could hear my message on any of those 4 aspects of a message. Okay? So you might hear everything I say with an appeal ear and think that by saying it's cold in here, I'm not just stating a fact, but I'm actually wanting you to do something about it. Or you might think that, well, actually, I'm just listening with a self-disclosure here, and if Gabriel says that it's cold in here, he must have chosen the wrong sweater, or must have forgotten his jacket, or whatever. It says a lot about him, doesn't say anything about what I should be doing. So people hear messages in very different ways in that respect, depending on which ear they're more attuned to. And this is the thing that makes communication quite tricky in many respects. It explains why miscommunication happens so easily, especially when we cut corners, when we do things like use emails, use WhatsApp, where you're only relying on the written words and where we don't necessarily pay too much attention to how we frame things, where we're not necessarily clear about what's the factual statement here, what does it tell us about the relationship, what does it tell us in terms of the appeal that people might read into it, and what is there in terms of self-disclosure that I'm revealing as part of my message as well. The other thing is, and this is really important, that it's the listener, not the speaker, that determines the meaning of a message. So the way the listener listens to the message determines how the message is understood. So even though I might just want to state a fact, if the listener listens with an appeal ear, then that's what they're going to think. They might completely skip over the fact and go straight into, oh, okay, so I'm supposed to do this. The other thing that's important to keep in mind is that everything is communication. So we cannot not communicate. Everything we do, even silence, is communication. And communication is really complex. It's really dynamic. So it develops between us. So for instance, if I start to waffle because I'm perhaps uncertain about what to tell you next, then you might go into, well, actually, I'm no longer listening to what he's saying because he's just waffling. And it's really interesting that he's waffling because he's normally quite self-confident. And so you're starting to listen at the kind of self-revelation side of my messages. And the more I feel like, well, actually, they're starting to not really pay attention to what I'm listening, the more insecure I might get. So that will affect the relationship in the communication, and it will kind of deteriorate from there. Yeah. So that's the dynamic in that I would then perhaps start to waffle even more, or try to find other ways to get myself out of it. So that kind of dynamic between one person and the other person in communication has a real impact on how things work and whether we manage to get into a positive cycle or whether we get into a negative spiral where things just go downhill. So that's the bit to keep in mind as well, is that it's always cyclical. Yeah. And we need to pay attention to where these cycles take us, and where we might feel like, well, actually, right now, I'm not sure I'm being properly understood. Let's just take a step back and look at what's happening. What have you actually heard? The other important bit is that we need to really pay attention to the relationship, because the relationship frames communication. So when we're unsure about the relationship, then the factual aspect of the communication gets easily lost, because there are so many questions potentially about the relationship, like how does this person see me? Who are they to me? And how can we improve our relationship, for instance? How might we be able to make it more equal or stuff like that? Become more important questions than actually what are they trying to tell me? And that would basically conclude that model. So I'm curious now to hear a little bit more from Nicole about her experience and practice around communication, and the extent to which this model can be quite helpful in trying to avoid miscommunication, or at least clarifying where things might be going slightly off plan. So Nicole, over to you.
Thank you. Morning, everyone. So I'm Nicole, I'm a social worker, and I have been working in adult services for the last 16 years, so that's my background. So I've got a lot of experience with working in MDT work, working with other agencies. and have experienced lots of miscommunication as well. So that's what I kind of wanted to focus on today. Just to give you a classic example of really working as a social worker with our healthcare colleagues in, I suppose, in an MDT setting. So if we think about, we are, for example, in an MDT meeting, and one of our health colleagues is describing or discussing an intervention or an issue. So that's basically, the facts of their involvement, what they're doing, what is our role. And then when we think about the relationship, sometimes the relationship between health and social care is not always as positive as we want it to be. And I think depending on maybe the situation and the issue of that meeting, we might come into that meeting with oh, what are they going to say? And are they going to do this? Are they going to do that? So the relationship might already be a little bit fractured. So the health professional might then go on and say, well, this is what we have been doing. This were our expectations, but we haven't heard anything from social care. So again, that's obviously feeding into that, initial thought of that relationship. And then sometimes, the other agency might say, well, what you need to do is you need to assess this person's capacity, or you need to go out and do this, that, and the other. And obviously, I think us as a social care, or it could be the other way around as well, of course, we feel a little bit like, hang on a minute, you're telling me how to do my job. This is not really how it works. You don't know what I'm supposed to be doing. And I think in terms of the self-statement of the other agency, it's about presenting their own agenda and maybe their judgment and their own values and ethics around that. And, because we are working from different perspectives, aren't we? It's the social model versus the medical model. And each party has got their own approach to ensure that we kind of, meet this person's needs in the best way. So, and I think, like Gabriel said earlier on, depending on with what ear you're listening and maybe with how many ears you're listening, sometimes it's quite easy to actually misread that intention of the message. That worker might just have the best interest at heart of that person and is really passionate about it and wants to push for their agenda and, using their approach, whilst I might be thinking, well, they want me to do this and it's not really my remit. So I think emotions are always running really high in MDT meetings. And I think practitioners can be protective and sensitive of their own work. And I think it's really important to go into those meetings and really have all ears switched on and listen to, what the speaker is saying in order to really read the message and to avoid miscommunication. So that was my example. Thanks for having me today.
Thanks, Nicole. Yeah, I think that's a really good example, and it kind of highlights the importance of kind of our emotional state and everything that happens that might get us stressed, that might add to the complexity and to those dynamics, kind of has an impact. And I very often hear people talk about, like, I was so focused on the relational aspect in this meeting that I came out and I wasn't sure what we had actually agreed. So the facts kind of got completely lost because of those kind of emotional turmoils and the kind of lack of clarity about, like, what is my relationship with the other professionals, and how do they see me, how do I present myself, and all of those kinds of aspects that can go on for people in those meetings. So yeah, it shows very much that it's all about what can we do to create a context in which we can actually feel settled enough to be listening with all those ears, and what can we do to be clear about which side of the message we're actually trying to put the emphasis on. So yeah, that sounds really intriguing in terms of what this could add to practice. We're just gonna go over to Alex now, who's used the model quite a lot and introduced it to loads of people on our courses, including some of the foster carers, where I think it's particularly interesting, given that it kind of breaches that divide between professional practice and private life very much, because foster carers work in their own homes. So it shows the model's applicability both in our professional context as well as in our personal life context.
Yes, Hello and good morning. I'm Alexandra Priver. I'm a social worker and social pedagogue by trade. Learned it over in Germany, lived here in the UK now over 10, and love this model. Had it in training, and it helps me everywhere. I don't know, one of my favorite examples is like when somebody tells you your hair looks really nice. Do you know that this information, your hair looks really nice, is the same? But why damn does it feel so different if my husband says it, if my daughter says it, if a friend says it, who I'm not so sure if is a friend, or a school mom on the way? Why does the same sentence cause so many things in my head? It lays really in that model for me and has helped me so often to draw it out and say, don't overthink it here. You have just nice hair. Or ask a feedback question. Do you really mean it? Anyway, so the example I wanted to share with you in terms of foster care had something to do around the food situation, and something for me very familiar. And an example this guy Schulz von Thun uses in a very similar way. But foster care after foster family after meeting the training and having met that model a bit later on a revisit or review or a retraining review, met again, and they had this lovely example about they shared it with their teenage children, that model. So a bit of a foster parents' household where this was appropriate to share with the children. And they worked out that this interesting sentence which came out one night from the husband to the mother in terms of they had a stew or soup or something. What's that green thing in there? And the foster mom browsed a bit up and said like, oh, it's parsley, you know what that is, and blah, blah, blah. And was like, yeah, not very pleased with that. And a lot has gone on, not only on the information. It was, give me the information, maybe he wanted to know. It's parsley. Tell me what it is, or that relationship, and that maybe a bit of the self-doubt from the foster mom. People don't like it. I'm cooking here all the time and I'm very criticized. So a lot of things have happened. While a few weeks later, when the foster boy asked a similar question, again, at a similar meal time situation, what's that green thing in the soup? She answered very differently. Explained it very kindly to him. It's parsley. You've not seen that, met that before, or it might have been a different herb at that time. And actually the foster boy pointed out that, well, a few weeks later, you reacted to the same question very differently as a question. And why was that? What was going on there? So I think it's a really good tool to support relationship building, because something is definitely going on for people when they're upset, or when we say something. I don't know if that ever happened to you. You said something to people and they get a bit upset, or in the worst case, when it's with teenagers in a care setting, they stomp out, or in a professional meeting, everybody turns against you. And you're like, hang on a second, that's not what I said, and it's not what I meant. And on reflection, that tool has hugely helped me to have a bit of help me to drive out where maybe things have gone wrong, where and what I maybe can do next time. And that is where this model is so really crucial. I'm responsible for the message I send, and I'm responsible for what I say and think. I'm not responsible for how it arrives. So if somebody gets really cross and angry with me, but I have a responsibility in my work settings as a foster carer, as a social worker, in a residential setting, and actually as well to my family partner, to my friends. I have the responsibility to check, hey, what's going on? What has happened? So I can ask for feedback. Did that what I just said made you cross? That was not my intention. I wanted to share the information with you. So at the moment, I have to front load a lot with my children that their grandma might not come over for the holidays. So I'm always saying, can't do anything. So I'm using this tool as well to front load the right stuff. Now in my regular ear, when I send information to them, I ask them to say like, you don't have to get up. You do not have to get up and do this immediately for me. A really good example is that my partner, I'm allowed to share this when I say things. It's a bit hot, it's a bit cold. I could do with a drink. Just say, and somebody is jumping up. And that is really nice. I think if we live a bit in a society, I don't know, big teams, there's this mechanism, somebody says, oh, I'm a bit thirsty, and everybody's like, yeah, get a cuppa, I'm getting it started. So this is to the dynamic of communication and how quickly things can get on when we maybe only try to send an information, or we do send appeals, or maybe, oh, I'm really thirsty. Where rain jump, I'm just seeing my antler. I'm really thirsty, and then we expect people to jump up. I have met that as well in teams where people send these appeals, and I then ask, would you like a drink? And would you like me to get it for both of us? So we can try to really, with feedback questions, asking, is that what you want? Is that what I've heard the right thing? Can try to diffuse a bit of this complexity and help us to, again, all not to overanalyze where people come from, but actually understanding and an empathy ground where this can grow and not pull apart. Because I try constantly to send an appeal and somebody is only getting the information. I don't know if that makes sense. So I'm really interested for people's question and feedback to the model.
Yeah, thanks very much, Alex. I think that those were some really, really helpful examples. And we always look at the examples that course participants provide us with. I remember the best example I heard was from a participant on a Scottish course who talked about friends of hers who lived kind of quite remotely and would get in the car every morning, drive down the drive towards the T-junction, and the husband would say, okay, and the wife would say, okay, and they would pull out. And they did that for about 10 years until they drove down to the T-junction again. Husband asks, okay, wife says, okay. He pulls out and bang, another car hits them. And he was just so perplexed and was asking her, like, why did you say it was okay for me to pull out when there was a car coming? And she was like, what do you mean? You asked me whether I was okay, weren't you? So sometimes this can go right for very long before it goes wrong. And it's only then that you might realize that we weren't talking at a factual level, we were talking at a relational level, or we thought we were when we weren't. So there you go. I'm sure you'll have lots of examples yourselves as well. So what I'd like to do is just for about 5 to 8 minutes, I will put you into small breakout rooms and just give you the opportunity to have a little chat. Any questions that you might come up with, or any sort of examples you might have, any reflections that this model might have sparked for you. Perfect. So I hope you had some interesting conversations, and I'm curious to hear any kind of reflections on the models, anything that's kind of sparked your thoughts, your conversations in your groups. We'd be happy to share a little bit about your conversation. Pam.
Yeah, we sort of took it back to what we talked about at the beginning, where it's how the listener interprets what is being said rather than the person who's saying it. And we talked a lot about text messages and WhatsApp and how it's, you know, it's not, you're not able to show the compassion through that. It's for young people, it's a way of communicating, whereas maybe for us, an older generation, it's just a matter of, oh, I'll see you later. But we talked about people, you know, delivering news through it, which is wrong, because it comes across very differently. You know, as managers, we've all had to deliver things that we've not been looking forward to. But I think if you're face to face, then you can show that compassion. You know, you can show that you're struggling as well. Whereas I think if it's sent in a message, it's just so flat and so harsh. You know, you're losing that relationship, and I don't think you can build the relationship through messaging, you know, and the lack of closure for people, because if you're ending something through a text message, you can then choose to ignore any follow-up, so then people are left with no closure. So I think it can have a longer term damaging effect.
Yeah, certainly. Yeah, that's really interesting, communicating difficult stuff through, say, WhatsApp or or email, because I think, you know, even in a professional context, for us, it does happen quite regularly, and perhaps there's some sort of you know, when you look at it from a self-disclosure aspect, perhaps for the person who needs to convey a difficult message, there's some sort of safety in not being faced with the other person as well. So I can see why it might feel tempting, but as you point out, it's when we look at it from the person who listens or who receives that message, it's very different, isn't it?
Yeah, it's got no feeling, it's got no compassion, it's got no level of understanding. And I do think people are bolder when they're doing it by email, you know. So it's like the keyboard warrior, isn't it? You know, everything comes through, but it comes through in a much bolder way. But would you be able to communicate that if you were sitting with the person? And I think it's quite cold and heartless at times as well. You know, it doesn't, we were saying about, you know, we say to young people, the phone is not your friend. It doesn't hug you, it doesn't wipe your tears, but it becomes the sole communication. And as you say, if you're on the receiving end, then you're not always seeing what that person is saying correctly. It's cold.
Hi, I would just like to say something if possible. I've got a bit of a croaky voice, so please apologise for that. But I think picking up from what Pam's just said in our group, I was just sharing that the kind of challenge of WhatsApp group during the pandemic. Just to explain, I'm from the University of Worcester. I'm a lecturer for the Department for Children and Families. And so for support, students set up a WhatsApp group, which is, you know, and they have had them post-pandemic. But I think in the pandemic, the WhatsApp group and the power of the WhatsApp group took on new significance. And, you know, I would suggest that it did become quite a strong tool of communication within the group. But as lecturers, we weren't party to that communication, but we were party to the fallout when the communication within that group caused anxiety, worry, just mainly around assessments. So, for example, when there was assessments, suddenly, you know, students become experts in assignment guidance, for example, which may not be fact. It may be a perception. But and obviously that's a challenge for us to manage, because we're not party to all of that communication to gain an understanding. And in our group, we were also talking about how within younger people or young adult culture, emojis play a significant part in conveying emotion and feelings. And again, a member of the group sort of shared that when a work phone didn't have the capacity for emojis, that can also lead to that kind of miscommunication. But I think there's a challenge, because I think as much as we want to kind of, you know, have that feeling of in-person communication and the power that holds to show compassion, to deliver difficult messages, to have that face-to-face conversation, I think we have to come to a place of acceptance that for some people, preferred communication is that kind of online approach. And so we have to adapt and think about how can we kind of develop that communication to still hold the compassion, and maybe it is an impossible task, but I would hasten to say that some young adults that we work with maybe will communicate with us in that manner, but would shy away from a face-to-face situation. And the pandemic has kind of enabled that to build at quite a catalyst, because that has been, you know, there's an option to keep your camera off or to keep your camera on. So that's the challenge we face, you know, kind of preparing people for the sector as well, working with children and their families. How do we manage that? Because it's with us. We can't say we're not going to use WhatsApp anymore. We're not going to use this tool which they see as a communication tool. But how do we inbuild those strategies that enable them to communicate with compassion, with care, with love, with you know, understanding the lack of intonation in conversation leads to lots of misinterpretations. So I'm really fascinated by the model that you presented, and thank you for that. But also I'm really interested in kind of this online element of communication that's very much part of culture now. How do we respond, and how do we understand, and how do we empower people to you know, have value in that, if that makes sense? But I've said a lot, so I'm going to be quiet now. But it's just I don't have any answers, but I just raise it as a point of discussion.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, Michelle, I think that that's a really, really important point, because it highlights the fact that, you know, we live in this world whether we choose to or not. We need to find ways to respond to how people want to communicate, and try to amplify some of the positives, some of the benefits. I know that, Kath, you guys have used things like WhatsApp groups and digital communication quite a lot at community circles. So I wonder if you might have any sort of thoughts on this.
Yeah, we use WhatsApp groups. We use Slack, which is a messaging app, which is a bit like WhatsApp, but has more functions. And I think we try and be really mindful to use compassionate communication when we write things, as well as when we're chatting. And we, you know, I'd like to think that the Slack groups, it's people that I know, and I'm really conscious we have really different learning styles. So I would always read a blog where my colleague would always want to watch an animate or a video. So really conscious that, yeah, so I often check in and ask if I'm being really clear in what I'm asking for. So I think that's something that we try and do, because I think we're conscious on Slack and on messages, we don't always get it right. We have in our team plan, we have something that around how we best communicate with each other. So I'm not a lover of phone calls. I would always rather see somebody. So Zoom is the next best thing, unless we can get together face to face. But yeah, phone calls I'm not keen on. So we share how we best communicate with each other. Yeah, and we use another tool around stress and support. And sometimes I think that's because in mine it says, what I've been told is what I'm thinking is written all over my face, and I'm not very good at hiding that. But people know to check in with me if what I'm saying doesn't match up with my facial expressions, you know. But just be thinking what people have been sharing this morning around WhatsApp groups, and I've no experience, but I've seen it on Facebook and on Twitter and things that, and I think it's mostly aimed at young people, but like I said, no experience of that. You know, if you're feeling low, or you're worried about, so you can text and somebody will text you back, and I'm guessing it's from a mental health support service. But I just wondered what those conversations are like. What is staff get? What's the guidance that people are getting around responding on text messages, or how your conversation looks? I'm guessing they have some guidance and some support around how to communicate well on text. But I'm curious. I'd really like to know a bit more about that.
Thanks, Kath. Yeah, I think there's, for me, there's also some of the power lies in helping people understand some of the communication models, and just to be more transparent about like how we analyze communication, what we see as concerns, and how perhaps young people or young adults can kind of be more mindful of like, when I just shoot this off on a WhatsApp group, how might this message be interpreted differently by different people? And what might I be disclosing that I'm not necessarily aware of, particularly if I'm like annoyed at someone, or if I'm bored, or whatever else might be going on. So things like the 4 aspects of a message can really help, or things like nonviolent communication was another thing that was mentioned here in the chat just now. So having a deeper understanding of some of those models that enable us to understand communication a little bit better and to analyze it and to see the dynamics, can be potentially really helpful just to give people the skills to navigate the digital world of communication. Because as you say, it is kind of there. We all need to grapple with it, and some of us prefer some aspects of it, and some of us don't. So there's also those kind of personal preferences, I think, that play a big part in it. And I think it's good to know that at least you know about some of the fallout that might come from WhatsApp groups as well. So there's something about what can we do to make sure that when things do go wrong, that we don't just leave people to try and pick up the pieces. So any more thoughts, reflections from your groups that you'd like to share? Did any of you come up with any good examples?
We had another great one shared around food in residential setting and relationships to people who prepare the food and how tough that can be. Would you like to say the example, Carolyn? Just, I think it's such an important one, or Marina or Nicole.
Yeah, just speaking about, so in my residential setting, we have a cook in place, and we have a young girl who just recently was accommodated. And the cook, I know her very well, and she's very nurturing and wants to, you know, provide the food for the kids and do her best and whatever. And she prepared a dinner recently for the young girl, and the young girl was rejected it, you know, using a few descriptive words and which were unpleasant. And we talk about the receiving end of that part of communication, and the cook really took offence to it, and she was really upset. And really not understanding that it wasn't about her cooking, it was about the circumstances and about moving in, and you know what she was communicating via the food probably was nothing to do with the cook, the food, it was the circumstances and how powerful that can be. We spoke about, you know, it was probably a safe thing to do to reject the food like that, because, you know, she might have said that the food's shite. But it wasn't about the food being shite, it was about the circumstances and where she was. So that's kind of where we got through our discussion on that and how powerful that was. Anybody else want to come in just because of it?
Yeah, no, I think the hypothesis we built already around what could go on for the young person or what could go on for the cook, I felt you had a lot of things to take away from just a really 7 minutes conversation, because some of the things,
using the model, being able to break it down into the 4 aspects like that. And I think it would be good for sharing that model, you know, giving the cook the understanding of all the different aspects of that. And what else was going on for the young person was really important, you know, for her understanding of that. We also kind of touched about, Nicole was using her example of in the professionals meeting, and you know, of all the emotions that are going around in that as well. So yeah, I felt the whole model, it would be really useful. I can see me using that when I go back into the residential setting.
That's great, yeah. And I think that the beauty of the model is that it's very simple, and when you discuss it with other people, they kind of get it, and they get a bit more attuned to like what is it saying about me when I communicate with others, you know, and that kind of self-awareness is really crucial as well in life, I think.
Yeah, I was wondering, exactly that example leans so well, and we might have all felt like that somebody criticized our food, and even it maybe was shit. That doesn't mean on the relationship level that our relationship is shit, or on the self-disclosure, it doesn't mean that they think that I am shit. I think that is so often where the information can get muddled in that as a feedback that we take it to ourselves, and so often people don't mean that. And in the social pedagogic world of thinking of self-development and learning, and the importance of feedback, and knowing as well what people might find shit what I do is really important. That I'm not taking it personal. I think that model explains really well where that sits, that taking it personal. So, sorry, thank you for that.
It's very hard sometimes to not take things personally, but I used to be a chef years and years ago, and I used to work in a residential home, and I built up a really good relationship with one of the chaps because I could cook his fried egg flat, and for him it was really important that his fried egg was flat. I mean, he did have autism, but it was really important, and it was even more important that I took the time to cook his egg flat. It did take some skill, but you know, quite honestly, if somebody says your food is shit, there's an opportunity there to start a conversation if your feelings aren't too hurt by it, because you can say, well, you know, is there something else I could get you? You know, it might be that they just want a sandwich, you know, and you know, or just maybe they're so upset they can't eat. So I mean, food's so important to people in residential homes. It's untrue. I did get into a lot of trouble because they all put on £7 when I cooked for them. So I didn't spare anything because I just thought it was really important because they needed to have exactly what they wanted. But I did make a rod for my own back. So, but because if people don't have any power, they need to be given some.
Yeah.
You know, and also the thing is that actually, when you're cooking for somebody, it is an act of love, whether it's professional or not. So yeah, it's difficult when you're being criticized.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important point. So I think that you made a really good point about the relationship and the power, and sometimes communication is one way in which people try to reclaim some power or exert power over others. So that's the relational aspect where we need to be really sensitive to, particularly if we are the ones with more power in a relationship, to think about how we communicate power by virtue of our body language, by virtue of our voice, by the words we choose and stuff like that. And I think the other bit that you mentioned there as well, which is important to highlight, is how do we respond to criticism? Because we kind of have two choices. So we either kind of go into the kind of our own self-disclosure of, oh my God, maybe my food really isn't very good at all, and I'm just not a very skilled cook, and I should probably do something else with my career, kind of thing. Or the other way is to kind of look at the self-disclosure of the other person and to kind of think about, like, who are they to kind of say that? What might be going on for them to say that? Because more likely than not, I don't think it has much to do with my food. It has more to do with where they're at right now, as Alex said. Or who are you know, you're not exactly a food critic yourself, so you know, who are you to say that my food is bad and for me to take that seriously? So we kind of have a choice in how we respond to criticism as well, in that respect, which is really quite helpful, quite liberating sometimes, particularly when somebody throws something hurtful at us. We can just focus on what might that say about them and where they're at right now and why they feel the need to kind of express themselves in that way. Which leads us a little bit to that question that Claire asked in the chat about the relationship between this model and nonviolent communication. I wonder, Alex, do you want to say something on that, given that you use...
I think it builds beautiful on it. I think it really, that the baseline from the Schulz von Thun model has really helped me for processing to nonviolent communication. So, but yeah, so I think they're working very well together. No competition, but as well, each model by itself stands nicely as a tool to further develop one's own reflection, feedback, and communication skills.
Yeah, absolutely. And having that kind of clarity of what might be going on, to be able to take a step back and to look at the different aspects that are at play in that communication, enables us to then kind of think about, okay, what might be a good non-violent communication statement that helps us get back into a more positive cycle in the communication, rather than noticing that perhaps things are deteriorating because somebody has misunderstood something and it's kind of perhaps fed into some negative self-concept of themselves. And how do we actually get out? That's where nonviolent communication can be really, really helpful.
I think that Marshall Rosenberg at the aspect to that tool, what emotions does it cause, and that they can, that violence in terms of the spiral of you hurt me, I hurt you now back. So another, the example with your hair is nice. What? My hair wasn't nice yesterday? What you're saying? That this can lead to arguments. I mean, Rosenberg went with violence, arguments, confrontation arguments, to violence, to the extent of being physical violent to each other. But already this little violence in our relationships, when we get crossed with each other because maybe we got something wrong or somebody else got something wrong.
Yeah. And so that brings us very nicely to a close. I have posted in the chat also the full reference to the paper, to Schulz von Thun's model. If you're German, there's a lot more written in German on the model. Otherwise, there isn't a lot in the English language, so I've put in one resource that I'm aware of. If you find anything else, please feel free to share it with us as well, because we're always happy to then kind of just make sure that it goes out more widely. If you're interested in communication, we have a couple of courses starting in January, including on courageous conversations. So how can we actually have more constructive communication, particularly around issues that are difficult to communicate? How can we find the courage to have those conversations? And we've got another course starting on developing relationship-centered practice. Again, that's important and relevant with regards to communication, like how do we put the relationship at the heart of everything that we do, as well as a course on relational leadership starting in February. So all the information on that is on our website in the news section. And apart from that, we will be back in the new year with more webinars. We'll let you know what they are very soon. And apart from that, I'd like to just thank Nicole and Alex in particular for their contribution. Thank you all for joining us, and hope that you'll have a wonderful festive season and get a bit of time to relax and spend with your nearest and dearest over the holidays and the new year. So hope to see you again in 2022.